Welcome back to the deep dive. Looks like we're really diving deep into the psychology of persuasion this time. You guys are trying to understand how it works and maybe even more importantly, how to resist it. We're tackling The Power of Persuasion by Robert Levine. And wow, this book does not disappoint. What's jumped out at you in all this material, expert speaker?
It is fascinating how persuasion is practically woven into every part of our lives. We often think of it as something like advertising or sales, but this book really shows how it comes up in almost any social interaction. What's really striking is how vulnerable we are to these tactics, even when we think we are immune.
Right. Reading through this stuff, I kept thinking, oh, I would never fall for that.
Yeah.
But then Levine just comes at you with all these examples like what's it called? The door in the face technique, where someone asks for something completely outrageous and then they scale back to what they actually wanted all along. And you're actually more likely to say yes. I mean, come on. That's so sneaky, but it clearly works.
Absolutely, and that really gets at one of the key takeaways here. We are often persuaded without even realizing it. We tend to overestimate our ability to resist manipulation. Levine calls this the illusion of invulnerability, and ironically, this illusion makes us even more susceptible.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole illusion of invulnerability. Why do we think we're so much better at resisting persuasion than everyone else?
Well, it's a common cognitive bias. It's called the better-than-average effect, where we tend to overestimate our abilities and underestimate our vulnerabilities. It's like that classic saying, everyone thinks they're a better-than-average driver.
Oh, totally. And it's not just driving. Levine gives so many great examples, like how people constantly believe they're less likely to get divorced than average. Statistically, that can't be true for everyone.
Exactly, and it also extends to how we view things like advertising. People will often claim that advertisements don't work on them, but they believe that they work on everyone else.
So if we all think we are so invulnerable, why do we fall for these tricks? What's going on there? What's the psychology behind that?
Part of it is that these techniques are often very subtle, operating below our conscious awareness, but it also has to do with how we attribute blame. When someone else gets fooled, we think, oh, they're gullible. But when we get fooled, we blame the situation.
So it's easier to blame that pushy salesperson than to admit that we might have been, I don't know, a little gullible ourselves.
Precisely. This lack of awareness is exactly what makes us more vulnerable. Levine even shares a story about himself getting completely scammed by a fake chimney sweep. The irony is, he knew about these persuasion techniques, but he still fell for it.
See, even the experts aren't immune. Okay, so maybe we are all a little bit gullible, but who are we most likely to trust? The book talks a lot about experts and authority figures.
Right. We have this innate tendency to defer to people we perceive as experts. It's a mental shortcut. We assume that they know more than we do, so we're more likely to just believe what they say.
It's like that old saying, trust me, I'm a doctor. But what makes someone seem like an expert? Is it just a title?
Well, credentials and titles definitely play a role. Levine actually highlights a study where a fake doctor convinced real nurses to administer dangerous doses of medication simply because he said that he was a physician. Just the perceived authority of that title was enough.
Wow, that's kind of terrifying. So just wearing a white coat and sounding confident is enough to make people believe you?
Not always, of course, but it can definitely increase our susceptibility. The book also talks about how jargon and technical language can be used to establish authority, even if the audience doesn't really understand what's being said.
So if someone throws around enough fancy words, we just assume they know what they're talking about.
It's a very common tactic, especially in fields like finance or technology. Think about financial advisors or tech salespeople. They often use complex language that can make them seem much more knowledgeable, even if it obscures the actual message.
That makes sense. But what about simple likability? Does being likable make someone more persuasive?
Absolutely. We are way more inclined to trust people we like and perceive as honest. This is why testimonials and endorsements are so effective in advertising. We see someone we admire using a product and we think, oh, I want that too.
Yes, celebrity endorsements are everywhere, but do they really work? I mean, come on. We all know they're getting paid to say that stuff, right?
Research suggests that they actually do have a significant impact, especially on children. Kids are much more susceptible to influence for celebrities because they haven't yet developed the same critical thinking skills as adults.
So those commercials with famous athletes promoting sugary cereals are actually shaping kids' preferences from a young age.
Exactly. And it's not just celebrities. The book discusses what they call the Maven approach, where companies will target influential people within certain communities to basically spread the word about their products.
Yeah.
These are people we already trust, our friends, family, colleagues, so their recommendations carry a lot of weight.
So it's like a stealth marketing campaign using word of mouth to generate buzz.
Precisely. And it can be incredibly effective because it bypasses our natural skepticism of traditional advertising. We are much more likely to believe a recommendation from someone we know personally than from some paid spokesperson.
This is all starting to sound a little manipulative. I'm wondering, are there any ethical ways to use these persuasion techniques, or is it all just about tricking people?
That's a great question, and it's something Levine addresses directly in the book. He argues that these principles can absolutely be used ethically as long as they're used transparently and with respect for the other person's autonomy.
So it's not about coercion or deception, but more about understanding how persuasion works, and then using that knowledge to communicate effectively and build genuine relationships.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. We've talked about the illusion of invulnerability and the roles of experts and honesty and likability and persuasion, but what about some of the more specific techniques? The book mentions this reciprocity principle. What is that all about?
The reciprocity principle is based on the idea that when someone does something nice for us, we feel obligated to do something nice in return. It's a deeply ingrained social norm, and it can be extremely powerful.
Like if someone buys you a cup of coffee, you feel like you owe them one.
Exactly. That feeling of obligation can be exploited by persuaders. One common tactic is giving away free gifts. Think about those free samples at the grocery store or the free trials you sign up for online.
Ugh, yes. Those free trials that then turn into paid subscriptions if you don't cancel in time. I have definitely fallen for that.
That's a classic example of the reciprocity principle at work. By giving you something for free, they create a sense of obligation, making you more likely to buy something later on. The book even has this fascinating example of how the Hare Krishnas actually used this technique to build their movement in the United States.
Wait, the Hare Krishnas, how did they use free gifts?
They would give away things like flowers or books in public places and then ask for donations. People felt obligated to give something back after receiving this gift, even if they didn't actually want the flower or the book in the first place. It was surprisingly effective.
So even a small, unsolicited gift can trigger this sense of obligation.
Absolutely. And the more valuable that gift, the stronger the obligation tends to be. This is why salespeople will often go out of their way to be extremely helpful. They offer advice, spend extra time with you, they might even do small favors, all to build up that sense of indebtedness.
It's like they're building up this debt that you feel pressured to repay later on.
Exactly, and often that repayment comes in the form of a purchase.
Wow, this is getting pretty deep. I'm starting to see how these seemingly simple principles can be used in really powerful ways. This makes me wonder.
Yes. What are you thinking?
Well, we've talked a lot about reciprocity, but what are some of the other persuasion techniques that we should be on the lookout for? I'm ready for more.
Well, the book delves into a principle called the contrast principle, and it really highlights how our perceptions of value can be manipulated.
Contrast principle. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's the idea that our perceptions are heavily influenced by the things we compare. For instance, if you lift a heavy weight and then a lighter weight, that second weight will feel even lighter than if you hadn't lifted the heavy one first.
Okay, yeah, I get that. But how does this apply to persuasion? How does this work in, like, the real world?
Well, marketers use contrast to make products or services seem way more appealing than they might actually be. Think about all those sales signs you see everywhere. By showing you that original price and then the discounted price, they're creating this contrast that makes the sale price seem like an amazing deal, even if it's not that different.
So it's all about framing. Make something look good by comparing it to something worse. I get it.
Exactly. And this principle goes way beyond just prices. It can be used to influence our perceptions of, like, quality, attractiveness, or even someone's personality.
Okay, so let's say a salesperson shows me a really expensive car first, something way out of my budget, and then they show me a more moderately priced car. That second car is going to seem like such a steal in comparison, even if it's still like pushing my limits.
Right. You got it. And that's just one way contrast can be used. It's pretty remarkable how much our perceptions can be manipulated just by simply changing what we're comparing something to.
I'm starting to feel like I need to wear a helmet every time I go shopping. There are just so many ways they're playing with our minds.
Well, that's why this awareness is so important. Once you understand these techniques,
Yeah.
you can start to, spot them in action and be more critical of the messages you're constantly bombarded with.
This is fascinating stuff. We've got reciprocity, contrast. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. What other mental shortcuts do we need to watch out for? The book talks about something called hot buttons.
Yeah, hot buttons are basically triggers that activate almost automatic responses in our brains. They sort of bypass our rational thinking and appeal to our emotions or our deeply held beliefs.
So it's kind of like those impulse buys at the checkout counter, the candy bars and magazines that you didn't even know you wanted until you saw them.
Exactly. Those displays are carefully designed to trigger our hot buttons. Maybe it's our desire for instant gratification, our need for a little comfort food, or even just our curiosity about celebrity gossip.
So we're not even really thinking rationally in those moments. We're just reacting to these triggers.
That's right, and marketers are incredibly skilled at identifying and exploiting these hot buttons. They'll use things like catchy slogans, celebrity endorsements, or even just evocative imagery to tap into our emotional responses and get us to make purchases that, we might not otherwise make.
It's like those ads that show people having an amazing time while drinking a certain brand of soda. They're not really selling the soda. They're selling the feeling of happiness and belonging that we associate with it.
Exactly. And those feelings can be really powerful motivators, even if we know logically that the product isn't actually going to magically make us happy or popular.
Okay, this is making me rethink my entire approach to shopping. I'm going to need a detailed list and like a personal mantra to resist all these temptations.
Well, as we've been saying, awareness is key. The book also talks about the importance of understanding your own personal hot buttons. What are the things that trigger you to make impulsive decisions?
Ooh, that's a good question. Um, I'm definitely a sucker for a good sale. Anything that promises to make my life easier or more organized, and oh, don't even get me started on chocolate. That's a major hot button for me.
That's great self-awareness. It's helpful to identify those triggers so that you can be more mindful in those situations.
Okay, hot buttons, check.
Yeah.
What about this idea of commitment and consistency?
Yeah.
The book talks about how once we make a commitment, we're more likely to stick with it, even if it turns out to be like a bad decision.
Yes. That's a really powerful principle that's rooted in basic psychology. We have this innate desire to be consistent with our past actions and beliefs. It's part of how we maintain our sense of self.
So if I tell someone I'm going to do something, I'm more likely to follow through even if I realize later it was a mistake, all because I want to, seem consistent.
Exactly, and this natural tendency can be exploited.
How so? I'm dying to know how this plays out in real life.
Think about those classic foot-in-the-door techniques that salespeople use. They'll start by asking for a small commitment, something that seems harmless, like agreeing to answer a few questions or trying a free sample.
Right. And then, once you've made that small commitment, you're much more likely to agree to a larger one, like actually making a purchase, because you want to be consistent with your initial agreement.
Precisely. The book also goes into what they call lowball technique, where a salesperson might offer you a fantastic deal, you're all excited, you commit to buying, and then they come back with all these hidden fees or additional conditions that weren't part of the original offer.
Ah, that is so frustrating. They basically change the terms of the deal after you've already said yes.
Right, and because you've already committed, you're psychologically primed to go along with those changes, even if you're not happy about them.
Wow, these salespeople are like master chess players, thinking several moves ahead. I'm starting to feel like a pawn in their game.
Well, remember, awareness is power. By understanding these techniques, we can level the playing field and make more conscious, informed choices.
Okay, so we've got commitment and consistency added to the list. Now, I'm wondering about the role of emotions, particularly fear. The book mentions that fear can be a really strong motivator.
Absolutely. Fear is a primal emotion. It triggers that fight or flight response and can completely bypass our rational thinking and make us act impulsively. Think about those commercials for home security systems. They show you all those scary images of burglars breaking into homes, playing on your fear of crime and your desire to keep your family safe. Then they offer you their product as, like, the solution.
Oh yeah, those ads are everywhere. But isn't that kind of manipulative, though? Using people's fears to sell them something?
It can be for sure. But fear can also be used ethically, like in those public service announcements about the dangers of things like smoking or drunk driving.
So it's all about the intention behind the message, whether it's being used to genuinely help people or just to exploit their fears for profit.
Right. The key is to be aware of how fear is being used and to really evaluate that message critically. Is it based on, legitimate concerns, or is it just trying to scare you into buying something that you don't need?
Good point.
Oh.
Okay, so fear, check. What about guilt and shame? Do those play into persuasion tactics too?
They absolutely can. Guilt is that feeling of remorse or responsibility when we believe we've done something wrong. Shame is more intense. It's a feeling of like humiliation or inadequacy.
So let me guess, if someone makes you feel guilty, you're more likely to do what they want.
It can definitely work that way. Think about those charitable appeals that show images of starving children or abandoned animals. They're designed to trigger our feelings of guilt and compassion, motivating us to donate.
I see. So we donate because we feel bad for those in need, and we want to alleviate that guilt.
Exactly. And shame can be used in a very similar way. Some advertisements, for example, might try to make us feel ashamed of our appearance or lifestyle choices, and then offer a product that promises to fix the problem.
Like those before and after photos in weight loss ads. They show you the before photo, which is supposed to make you feel bad about yourself, and then the after photo, which is, the ideal you that you're supposed to strive for.
That's a classic example. They're playing on our insecurities and our desire to fit in with societal expectations.
Man, this is heavy stuff. I'm realizing just how much these persuasion techniques can really mess with our heads, especially when we're not aware of them.
That's exactly why this awareness is so crucial. Once we understand how these tactics work, we can start to build up our resistance and make more conscious choices.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. Reciprocity, contrast, hot buttons, the power of fear, guilt, and shame. It's a lot to take in. I have to say, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but also kind of empowered. It's like knowing the magician's secrets. The show might be a little less magical, but it's way more interesting because you understand how it all works.
I love that analogy, and it highlights a really important point. Understanding these techniques doesn't make us immune to their influence, but it does give us a much greater sense of agency. We can choose how we respond to these messages rather than just reacting on autopilot.
Right, it's about taking back control of our own minds. So we've explored the dark side of persuasion, all these sort of sneaky tactics that are used to manipulate us. But what about the good side? Can these same principles be used for good?
They absolutely can be. As we touched on earlier, these principles can be used ethically and effectively in so many areas of life. Think about things like education, public health campaigns, even just our everyday interactions.
So it's not about abandoning these principles altogether. It's more about using them, wisely and responsibly.
That's the key. And this is where this concept of framing becomes really important. It's not just about using contrast like we talked about earlier. It's about strategically choosing how we present information to emphasize certain aspects and influence people's choices in a positive way.
Okay, I need an example.
Mm.
How can framing be used for good? Paint me a picture.
Okay, sure. Let's take something like encouraging people to save for retirement. If you frame it as a loss, like you're losing money every day, you don't contribute to your 401k, it might trigger fear and avoidance. People don't like to think about losing money.
Right, that makes sense. A negative message like that doesn't exactly inspire you to take action.
But if you frame it as a gain, like imagine the financial freedom and security you will have in retirement if you start saving now, it becomes much more motivating and appealing. You're focusing on the positive outcomes.
I see. So it's about highlighting the potential rewards instead of the risks.
Exactly, and this principle can be applied to all sorts of things. Want to encourage people to eat healthier? Frame it as boosting their energy and overall well-being, not just about restrictive diets.
That's a great point. It's like those positive affirmations you see all over social media these days. I am strong, I am healthy, I am capable.
Exactly. It's about framing your message in a way that resonates with people's values and aspirations and encourages positive change.
Okay, framing. That's key. But knowing that there are all these master persuaders out there, how do we resist the ones who are trying to manipulate us? The book talks about this idea of inoculation. I'm curious, what's that all about?
Think of it like a vaccine for your mind. By exposing yourself to weaker versions of persuasive arguments, you can build up resistance to stronger, more manipulative versions later on.
So it's like training your brain to recognize and reject those sneaky tactics, like a mental workout.
Precisely. The book gives this example of teaching kids about advertising. By showing them how ads use all these tricks and persuasive techniques to make products seem more appealing, you can help them develop a more critical eye from a young age.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're less likely to be swayed by all those flashy commercials and celebrity endorsements if they understand the psychology behind them.
Exactly. And inoculation can be applied to all sorts of situations where you might encounter persuasive attempts. Like if you know you're going to be facing a high-pressure sales pitch, you can mentally rehearse your responses and boundaries beforehand.
So you're not caught off guard and pressured into making a decision you'll regret later. I like it.
Right. And the book also stresses the importance of, critical thinking skills in general. Don't just accept things at face value. Question assumptions, look for evidence, consider alternative perspectives. It's about engaging your mind, not just passively absorbing information.
It's like that old saying, if it aims too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly. Maintaining that healthy sense of skepticism, it's one of the best defenses against manipulation. It's about trusting your gut and being willing to, question things that don't feel quite right.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about the psychology of persuasion, both the good and the bad. I'm definitely going to be much more mindful of these techniques in my own life,
Hmm.
both how they influence me and how I might use them to positively influence others.
Me too. And it's important to remember that persuasion is simply a part of life. It's not about becoming, completely immune to influence, but about understanding how it works and making conscious, informed choices that align with our values.
Well said. And for you listening, we'll leave you with this final thought from Robert Levine. The best defense against manipulation is a well-informed mind. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep thinking for yourselves. Your mind is your most valuable asset. Protect it.
Absolutely. The more we understand about the world around us, the better equipped we are to navigate it with confidence and integrity. Knowledge is power, and with that power comes responsibility. Use it wisely.